Cybercriminals are using social engineering loaded with urgency and fear to successfully prey on victims, your employees, or your customers. Protect your Office 365 email from today's most sophisticated attacks with Barracuda Email Threat Scanner. It's a free tool to help protect your business from these hard-to-detect attacks. The Barracuda Email Threat Scanner uses artificial intelligence to hunt and eliminate Office 365 email threats. Find the cybersecurity threats hiding in your Office 365 email right now. Get your free email threat scan at securityweekly.com/Barracuda. Searching for the best way to protect passwords and privileged accounts? Thycotic empowers security and IT operation teams to discover, secure, and manage all types of privileged accounts with the fastest time to value of any privileged access management solution. Get up and running fast with solutions for privileged account discovery, turnkey installation, automation, auditing, and reporting tools with Thycotic's free 30-day trial. Thycotic, the fastest growing PAM provider in the market, available both on-premise and in the cloud. Get started today with a free Thycotic secret server trial at securityweekly.com/Thycotic. Stopping advanced threats requires knowing exactly what you're up against. ExtraHop Reveal X is the only solution that shows you not just where intruders are going, but where they've been. 90-day look-back and complete network visibility across the data center, cloud, and device edge help security teams respond 84% faster with ExtraHop Reveal X network detection and response. Explore the interactive demo at securityweekly.com/ExtraHop.
Welcome back to RSA Conference 2021, live from Virtual Broadcast Alley. I am your host, Matt Alderman. Joining me for this segment is Deepika Gajaria. She is the Vice President of Product at Tala Security. Welcome, Deepika, to Security Weekly.
Thank you very much, Matt. Glad to be here.
Now, we had an awesome interview last night with Anand on Application Security Weekly around web security and privacy, and in this segment we're going to talk about some of the new areas of privacy, and how do you enforce those privacy settings specifically in the browser, because as we think about all the third-party plugins and all the other things that happen at the browser level, create some interesting challenges. But let's start with what's happening in the privacy space.
Absolutely. And I think you hit it on the head, right? The browser is where we focus. And I wanted to just take a step back and talk a little bit about where we are today, right? So you don't have to look very hard to find stories about privacy breaches, ransomware attacks, and so on and so forth. And I think what stands out with all of us is sort of the lack of preparedness that enterprises have, given all of these implications that you get with compliance regulations like the GDPRs and the CCPAs of the world. And if you look back not that far ago, just 45, 50 years ago, when the US Privacy Act came out, they focused on how the US government was collecting data from its citizens, how they were sharing data between organizations and consent and so on and so forth. And if you fast forward to today, think of that same paradigm on the web, think of that same paradigm for data privacy, right? So there are two aspects or two sides of the coin with consumers and with enterprises, right? So consumers are always concerned about who has access to my data, what are they doing with it, did I give them consent to do anything with it? And on the enterprise side, they're answering those same questions. They have a vast supply chain, right? So they have third-party vendors, and we've seen that with a lot of these websites have a lot of third parties that have marketing chatbots, they have analytics tools, performance tools, etc. But what ends up happening is a lot of these third parties then have access to their customer data. So I think when you really look at where the privacy space is today, at least on the web, it's still sort of the wild, wild west in terms of who has access, why they have access, and what they're doing with that data. So that's sort of where we focus on, at least in Tala Security, we focus on the privacy of the web, its implications, and what tools you have between sort of security organizations and the privacy organization to ensure that breaches don't happen, number one, data oversharing isn't happening without your consent, and then the controls and the automation that can keep you in check along the way.
Yeah, I think a really good example of this is every time you go to a website, there's at least two things that pop up. Number one is cookies, and whether you're going to accept cookies or not, and GDPR really enforced the whole cookie accept process. The other thing is, because I have my browser so locked down, it asks whether I can share my location or other aspects of access to my camera or my microphone or my whatever, right? And that's because I have a pretty locked down browser, probably not as locked down as it maybe should be. But I mean, these are the first things that people see sometimes when they go to a brand new website. And that is driven by GDPR, and that's driven by privacy requirements. But not every organization enforces that lockdown at the browser to make people either accept or block certain aspects of what the browser wants to collect.
Yeah, absolutely. And if the one thing that you hit on, right? So there's one aspect of, yes, enterprises have a checkbox. If you make cookie consent banners, we all have seen it. We all accept, and we kind of go, okay, there's yet another one I have to select. But then what? So one aspect of it is, yes, adhering to what governance is telling you to do. But the second aspect is, are you really honoring my preferences as a consumer when I make those selections, right? And that is the key. And that's the key where when we talk about privacy and security and the convergence or the intersection of those, that is where the controls come in place. And you spoke about one where, okay, they're asking for my microphone access. Well, yes, enterprises can actually limit what, say, third-party vendors that are on their site can actually access. There's a wide variety of controls, right? So you can talk about CSP, which is content security policy, where you can lock down who your vendors actually can, or who your vendors actually are on your site, different aspects of your site. But there's things like feature policy. A lot of these browsers support where you could say, well, this vendor has access to cameras and or not, and you have all of these sort of limitations or locking down in place of what preferences can be honored. And I think that's the key. And when you think about, I think CCPA has something, and they've actually enforced more of these under the privacy aspect of it, is consumers now also have a right to ask enterprises if all those consents or the preferences that they've requested has actually been honored. So now it's kind of coming full circle. Enterprises can't just give them sort of the cookie consent banner. They actually have to make sure the right policies are then put in place. And in fact, we had a great conversation with one of our customers recently. This use case actually came from the security team, which was a little different, right? Because you always think privacy teams are the ones, or the compliance teams are the ones looking for this. But how do they then translate those, the requirements, if you may, into the technology and the process that the security team had to then adhere to? So I think it's great. Organizations still are siloed in the sense that privacy compliance teams are one side of the house, kind of the legal side, and then there's the technology side. But if you really want to be sort of privacy first, security first, and all these practices we talk about as an industry, you kind of have to get to the crux of the problem where it's one and the same. You've got to have controls and remediation based on what you find on the privacy aspect of the house.
Yeah, and I think the biggest challenge in the browser is enforcing, or building the policy to then enforce the policy. Now, there are capabilities within the browsers, but if you're in an environment that has multiple browser support, trying to manage all this individually probably gets a little challenging. So how do you set kind of that corporate privacy policy that you want to enforce across all the browsers, regardless of what your employees are using, and then know that you're staying within those policies? That's a challenge, because, like I said, the individual browsers support these capabilities, but to do it at scale and to do it across multiple browsers is not that easy.
Yeah, absolutely. And fortunately, at least some of the top 3 browsers, if you may, that most consumers are using do support a lot of these policies, right? And that's the beauty of kind of using standards-based controls, which is sort of what we do on the security platform that we already have. And when you translate that over, even on the privacy side, depending on what browser technology you're using, feature sets like content security policy will actually give you the policies that your browser will then accept. And that's the beauty about that. And it's not just CSP and some other stuff, right? So there's a number of technologies out there. And as and when, users are kind of moving between browsers, they get specific sort of policies, if you may, based on their preferences. And that's the beauty about it. And yeah, go ahead, Matt.
No, I was going to say, so that's great. I mean, I can enforce the policy. How do I audit against the policy? What is the data that comes back that says, yes, we didn't allow access to my location, my camera, my whatever? Because the second point that you made in your kind of opening statement was, it's not only the policy, but you've got to prove the policy. And then let's say that a piece of data was collected that I didn't really give them access to. how do I get rid of it, right? I mean, that's one of the fun things with GDPR is the ability to understand what data they're collecting and the ability to delete that data. That's a challenge if you don't have an audit mechanism in place to also validate that policy is not collecting that data.
Yeah, and there are multiple things, right, based on what you said. So if you take a step even further back, before you even get into this whole audit process, we've seen this firsthand, right? We talk to customers day in and day out on their security posture, if you may. They're always concerned about data exfiltration. And then when you think about this problem, it goes hand in hand with the privacy piece. Well, third parties are rampant, right? So we all know that. SolarWinds told us that we not only need to worry about our own security posture, we also need to look at the vendor's security posture. And then you think about it, if there are X number of third parties, and in some websites or some enterprises, they don't even have a sense of who those third parties are, let alone what those third parties are collecting and why they're even there, right? So that's sort of that first side. Before you can even audit sort of your privacy policies, you first have to get a good inventory, if you may. And the second aspect is now there's, again, multiple teams. There's the marketing team that's obviously adding all of these tag managers and, chatbots, et cetera, for rightfully so for their business needs. The GRC team has, a list of compliance checks that they need to do. So the whole piece, again, around the silos that there are in enterprises have to go away. And CISOs also, right? They're tasked with so many things. There's the OWASP top 10 that they need to deal with. Now they need to deal with, they don't want to be inhibitors in a way to say, okay, you're not allowed to add these third parties on the site. So there has to be that process from early on. Everything from developers, vetting what code they're adding, who these vendors are, if the reputation's okay, to the vendor sort of agreements that the GRC teams and others have to adhere to, right? So I think vendor risk assessment teams, of anything, have to be sort of in the mix from the beginning in trying to understand why these vendors are on the site, what their purpose is, and how they're being used. And to your point on sort of that continuous audit, that's essentially what we do. At least at Tala, what we're trying to do is we don't want to have this manual approach. It's after the fact, if there's if there's a breach that happened or whatever it may be, but it's something that it's like an ongoing process that the security teams are involved with, the privacy teams gets reports on, and then we're monitoring all of these sort of vendors, their reputation, the sort of the access level, if you may, of what data they have, etc. So to your point, absolutely, it's not a one-time process. It's not one team. In fact, it's a group of people who have to work together. And that is where I think the challenge is. And that's where there's a lot of promise, because there's a lot that can be done in that case.
Yeah, I want to double click on the third-party piece for a second, because I ran a third-party vendor management program for one of the large national banks, had to manage 70,000 vendors. I can tell you for a fact, Google Analytics, HubSpot, pick your form product of the day, they weren't even on my list, right? But to this third party component, these are things that you embed into your website to collect information, but yet you don't fully understand the security or what they're doing with that data, or sometimes even the data that's going out, to even add it into a third-party vendor management program. Because we think about, our third-party vendors as, who's processing our data over here, who's doing our printing over here, or what other services. Sometimes I don't think the third-party vendor management teams are even thinking about, well, what's Google Analytics doing on your website? What is that form from HubSpot collecting on your website? Those are all third-party relationships. All that data is being stored and collected and stored somewhere outside of your environment. And those are some big challenges for third-party vendor management.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there, again, if you break this down again in terms of the silos and where in the process this needs to happen, right? So there are two pieces. There's data at rest in all of these databases that we've already collected. Me as an enterprise owner saying, okay, you know what? We're handling this data. Okay, our data retention policies, data sharing, etc. And that's probably where the process aspect comes in, where it was all manual. It was in some database or some checklist based on what the vendors were or who the vendors are, right? But this is what I'm talking about in terms of the website, right? It's ever changing and it's evolving day to day. I mean, I do that on our website, on the Tala website. I'm going, well, you know what? Can we add a tag to see who's, inputting form information? Do I talk to the security team every single time? Probably not, right? So that is exactly the challenge. And that is the reason why you need a tool that's constantly sort of monitoring and scanning your resources. And that's where you'll pick it up. And also where in the process you hit the sort of the idea of, well, it's after the fact, right? Well, if I'm a developer adding code and I'm already adding in integrations, certain vendors, the scripts or whatever, so on and so forth, and marketing teams are then adding additional pieces, all of that is then picked up. Especially with a scanner like what we do with Tala, we detect all of that firsthand when we scan. And the aspect of the audit is that it is continuous, right? So we will then alert you. And that is the piece I was talking about. A lot of the awareness is also missing, right? So the vendor assessment teams probably don't even know what's on their site. So I think the first step really is trying to break down those silos, have that good sense of what's on your site, ensure that you're being compliant, and then have some automated process. So it's the three things that I talk about is people, process, and technology. You want to make sure all the teams are aligned in terms of whatever you need to do. You have the processes in place, who needs to do what, and that's critical, much easier said than done. And then the technologies or the tools that can aid you to do that more sort of efficiently.
Yeah, one of the areas we touched on a little bit last night with Anand, I'm curious on your take on this and how you do it is, when we think about, yes, I get the data, the process side, right? The one thing development teams don't want is to be slowed down. The marketing teams definitely don't want to be slowed down, right? They want to add these tags. Is there anything we can do proactively? I mean, process is part of it, but can we bring technology and process a little closer together so that when the marketing team makes a change to the website to insert a new tag or insert a new form or something like that, that it can be a little more proactive so it's not after the fact? Because those processes, if they take too long, everybody's going to bypass them, right? Because that's just what we do as humans. I'm just curious how you can support some of that more real-time proactive capabilities just to make it easier for all the teams to do what they need to do, their jobs, right, but also make sure that the right privacy and security settings are in place for those third-party components.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll give you an example of how one of our large customers does it, right? It's a large financial. There are multiple teams doing this. And to your point, the security team in no way, who's sort of the central governing body, if you may, wants to slow things down. So there are two things. We touched a little bit on sort of that CI/CD pipeline, or where in the development and sort of the production or pre-production and staging environments where some of this can be done. But there's also a notion of, can we have a central repository, right? So a lot of enterprises have a good sense of who these vendors are, to the point where who's in their allow list, if you may, of reputed vendors. That's one thing. But who's vetting them? Is there a process where you can do that in an automated way, where you can input, say, certain vendors or certain scripts in this case, and then a technology like Tala vets them, looks at the reputation, says, okay, check, it looks okay. So you can go through the next step of the process where you can then add it on, right? So I think having that central repository where somebody is continuously monitoring resources, ensuring that there is a hop with the security team in the middle, right? In terms of not just a checkbox saying, okay, they've reviewed the code, but that's an inbuilt process that they already have, where prior to releasing any code on the website, they have to kind of go through that process. And like I said, I think CISOs have enough on their plate, right? So they're already dealing with so many attacks vectors and things. But when you think about it, data exposure recently made it to the top 3 in the OWASP, right? So the list. So this is not something that's after the fact. It's so closely related to all the other initiatives that's going on the security side, right? And that's, I think, one thing I'd like to urge enterprises to think about is it's one and the same, in that one can be solved with the other. And it's critical to have both aligned in terms of even the teams and even the processes in place.
Yeah. And so I'm curious, do I think about my third-party vendor management, having vetted my vendors, vetted who's allowed to have those third-party plugins, knowing that the reputation is right, then integrating that with more on the development and marketing teams to say these are the things you're allowed to have in, and anything else is an exception that has to go through a more formal review. But outside of that, now I know who my vendors are. I know their reputation's good. I know that these are validated as part of my pre-production to release stage, and then you just deal with the exceptions, because otherwise I think this gets a little challenging.
Yeah, exactly, right. And I think to your point, there has to be some sort of a balance. I mean, CISOs, CPOs, like privacy officers, you kind of have to balance business needs. You can't have things, even with cookie preferences. If I choose none as a consumer and say, I don't want anything on there, I'm going to kind of get a suboptimal experience on your site, right? So if I don't want it optimized. So in a similar way, when you're looking at sort of security and privacy, you need to balance business needs. You want to make sure things are, and the primary goal again on the website is making sure consumers have that best experience online. But part of that also is you want to make sure you're safeguarding their data. So you need to have a clear balance on that. And I think having that privacy first attitude and that privacy program overall, and we're seeing that more, right? With sort of hacks, like I said, with SolarWinds, it's kind of gotten it to the forefront where third-party assessment is one thing, but you want to make sure their security posture and their privacy posture is also suitable for you as an enterprise. So I think they're all moving in the right step, and even sort of the new cybersecurity task force that we have, they're talking about that repository, right? That we can kind of, enterprises can look into. So all of those things, I think, go in with what Tala is doing and how we want to align with security teams, but also enable privacy teams, help them honor all of these sort of consumer protection, pieces that compliance regulations get you, but also do that in a very seamless, ongoing fashion. So it's not one time set and forget, but you can actually monitor this and make it more automated for you.
Yeah, we're going to see more privacy regulation, not less. I'm just hoping we do it at more of a national level so it makes it a little easier to manage versus the breach laws, which were 50 states. And hopefully we'll make some progress there on that front. But we're big believers that, if we can do this at a more national level, it will streamline, hopefully, the privacy requirements and some of the privacy policies that organizations need to implement instead of creating 50 variations of a privacy requirement.
Absolutely. I don't think any organization is equipped to looking at that full time. And I think having sort of that privacy first approach where it's in your design principles and it's part of your DNA in some sense is the way to go. And absolutely, GDPR is great for Europe. I mean, I know in the US we've been talking about more and more of this, but really it's those 3 or 4 basic questions. Who has access to what data, why they are, and if they are, then what do you do about it? And that's the piece that has to be sort of, baked into place.
Great. Deepika, thank you so much for joining us on Security Weekly.
Thank you so much for having me. Looking forward to this in the future.
Yes. And if anybody wants to learn more, please visit securityweekly.com/Tala Security. That is the end of our micro interview live stream for today. But stay tuned. Business Security Weekly is coming up next.
Welcome back to the RSA Conference 2021, live from Virtual Broadcast Alley. I'm your host, Paul Asadorian. Joining me for this interview, Scott Scheferman, Principal Strategist at Eclipsium. The landing page, today we're going to be talking about all our devices aren't belong to us. I love the title. You can learn more about Eclipsium at securityweekly.com/Eclipsium. Scott, welcome to the show today.
Thanks, Paul. Good to be here. Always, this is time to rock and roll. I can't wait.
Absolutely. Yeah, I liked it. We were just actually chatting before we started recording, and I like this way of thinking about the assets, if you were, in your environment. And those are things that you can control and put an agent on, such as the Windows systems in your Active Directory or Azure AD domain, for example. There are appliances, which we've seen certainly some breaches against these appliance-style kind of devices and services that are provided. And then I think like all the way on the other side are IoT devices, small connected devices that we find in our homes, but also our businesses as well, and certainly in industrial control systems. And Scott, I guess my first question is from a trust and a firmware perspective and control perspective, how do we deal with these 3 different classes?
Yeah, no, that's really kind of become the question of the hour. when organizations are like moving to full SaaS models, or they think they are, they're going full digital, full crazy, they're always going to, like any significant organization's always going to have a hybrid kind of scenario where they're half in the cloud, they're half SaaS, and they're still half enterprise gear, devices like you just mentioned, and then chock full of IoT as well. And if you look at the modern enterprise, I can't remember who it was, but somebody just did a study, maybe it was Aramis, where 90% of these devices that we find ourselves with in the enterprise are what you might call agentless, which is like you said, you can't put a AV, EDR, Tanium, or any other kind of agent on there to understand and control that device. And so if you break it into those kind of three categories you just did of what we might call BTOS, or below the operating system, which is a term that like CISA uses internally, and there's a talk on that for RSA this year. I think there's 2 talks. One's an in-depth version. That's covering everything below the traditional Windows operating system or Mac or Linux, which is all that firmware for which you and I have had these conversations a number of times now, where there's also little security control over for the enterprise. And then in the middle category that you just articulated, you have these appliances, VPNs, firewalls, routers, but also like large file transfer devices like Excellion or FileZen, or also medical imaging hosting, boxes. And these are boxes like any other box. They look, smell, feel the same as any other box, but they have an operating system on them. Pulse Secure, example, it has an operating system. It's not firmware, but it's unmanaged still. There's no agent on that. And I think bad guys have figured that out. And we as enterprises have kind of succumbed to threats that are targeting those devices almost as a form of a supply chain dynamic. You get the device, and then you get all that device's customers. Through one vulnerability or chain vulnerability, you get many customers, and then those customers too, like what happened with Excellion. And then there's the IoT, which is a conversation that you and I are probably blue in the face over, but still nonetheless important.
And I find it interesting, Scott, too, just, having worked in enterprises and been responsible for IT and security throughout my career, I understand the decision to go with the appliance, because you don't necessarily want to own and manage everything. I know, like the hardcore Linux geek and even inside of me wants to go, I want control and manage everything, down to all the packages in the kernel that's in everything. But when you start growing as an enterprise, you don't even have to grow that much before you realize, I don't know if I want to be in everything and responsible and have that much control over everything, because with that control comes responsibility. Therefore, we rely on these appliances to provide a service that we kind of absolve ourselves from some of that responsibility, but we also lose control. And that's a tricky decision.
Yeah. I as listeners know, I spent first 15, 16 years supporting largely DoD cyber, right? And in that world, you have concepts like area of responsibility, or literally the term security control comes up like daily when you're doing risk management or risk analysis. It doesn't do so in the commercial world, because we've kind of turned our head the other way, like you said, and absolved ourselves of the difficulty, the resourcing requirements. We, through SLAs and even cyber insurance, we offset those risks, et cetera. But what has come to haunt us is that dynamic. In 2020, 2021, it's no longer okay to just do that, because businesses are going down. Like if you look at, the news today, Colonial Pipeline, we have to talk about it just because it's in the news. You're looking at an IT event affecting operational environment, shutting down the gas line. There's also devices that sit between IT and OT, right? Like firewalls, like no need to mention vendor names, right? Those firewalls are supposed to be the air gap. And as you know, they're absolutely not. And over time, they never are. And you get weird rules like zone to zone rules, or, SMB sneaks through because of some setup operation. It's left on. Like those are sieves. They're not air gaps. Right. And the problem is those devices themselves is not just the firewall policy. It's the actual device. It's counterfeited motherboards inside, let's say, whatever, in the past Cisco devices, or it's an implant that's been proven to be able to put into a device like that, or it's a config, or it's a supply chain kind of thing. There's so many ways the box itself is getting targeted. And most organizations don't do that right, or they rely on the OEM vendor to provide them the right alert and telemetry about the integrity of that device. And that also is broken. Because here we are, supply chain attacks like SolarWinds, et cetera, carrying out, where it's like you can't just trust the OEM vendor or your normal platform IT to tell you whether a device is what it says it is.
Yeah, because it is a supply chain thing, because we've left it to our OEM vendors, right, to acquire the right software and hardware, integrate those pieces together with some custom software likely on top of it, and that's what becomes the appliance. But we in the enterprise don't, unless we dig, and right, all of us of nerds have probably dug into some of those and go, oh, like it's running that component in this component in that component. But unless you're digging into those, which could violate some agreements and licenses and things like that, you're not going to know what exactly that device is running unless you look. And so you could have this implicit trust with the vendor, or you could look on your own. And I think your mileage is going to vary depending on how deep you want to dig, right?
Well, yeah. Just like in the below the operating system firmware, right? Motherboard firmware, if you will. On these appliances, just because the firmware there or the device OS tells you it's version XYZ.
Yeah.
You do a scan, you say, okay, it's XYZ. So that means I know I have this, and this CVE vulnerabilities, and I need to patch or manage risk accordingly. But when the OS is itself compromised, when that firmware of that appliance is compromised, you can't trust that the OS is what it says it is, and nor should you. And that kind of implicit trust that you're getting from your current telemetry with like traditional vuln scanners or OEM solutions telling you, for patch management, like that's what's broken right now. So we need to take back to security control. And if you look at the executive order that just came out, I don't know if you want to talk about that for like 2 minutes, but that thing is broad reaching. I think it's awesome for the industry. I think it actually will have change. Yes, there's all sorts of rub everywhere when an executive order comes out, but one of the things that needs to be defined in the next 45 days is what you call the definition of critical software, quote unquote, critical software. And to meet that definition, NSA, CISA, OMB, they have to put their heads together and say, what are the softwares out there that match the 5 criteria that determine what is critical software? And if you look at the 5 criteria, Paul, they're literally one-to-one synonymous with almost the definition of firmware. Things like the level of privilege required to function. Yeah, well, firmware's ring 0 or lower. Right. Integration of dependencies with other software. Yes. How about the operating system needing to trust what the firmware is doing before it loads? Direct access to network and computing resources. That is the definition of what firmware does with network devices. Yeah. Right? Direct access. Performance of a function critical to trust. This is quintessentially important. There's all sorts of certificate trust manipulation and problems at the firmware and boot level. And when you talk about supply chain, you talk about the SBOM, software bill of materials. Well, never mind that. Let's talk about the FBOM. Because here we are. But the firmware bill of materials is equally, or if not more so important, and certainly more critical to understand, because your whole trust foundation is built on firmware. And the last one is whether or not you have potential harm if this software is compromised. Well, I don't need to tell you or anybody else listening that if you compromise firmware during supply chain or you implant it afterwards, you have the same things that like the Russian GRU or WinNT group and China group or TrickBot tries to do, which is implanting so low that your security stack can't find it, right? And can't see it and respond to it. So yeah, the potential for harm if you break a device at the motherboard level, astronomically worse than just ransoming it, encrypting files.
Yeah, and it's difficult to have visibility because each of these appliances are so unique. Because they could say, like you said, if you have your traditional security stack and it tells you how, hey, it's running Linux. But if it's customized firmware in some way, you don't know how they've customized that Linux stack, all the way from bootloader up through applications and kernel and file system in between. Now you've got this custom recipe that it could be a disastrous meal or it could be like a really great meal, but also it changes with each release, right? And that visibility into these customized firmwares has always been challenging, I think. Whether we're talking IoT devices or appliances, it's always super challenging unless you dig in and you customize your security stack to find those. You're not gonna. You're gonna get false positive and false negatives, basically.
Yeah, and I think like when it comes to appliances, what you just said is kind of crept up on us, because if you look like a national vulnerability database and you look for VPN vulnerabilities and those kind of devices, from 2016 to 2021, I just did this last night, there's a 6x increase in the number of vulnerabilities for that class of device, VPN. I don't know of a single OEM that makes VPN hardware that hasn't been involved in nation state and criminal activity in the last 18 months or 2 years, especially.
Yeah.
I don't know of a single one. And so if you take like the Pulse Secure device, and every device has this day in the sun. This one was just recently, a couple of weeks ago, is 0 day floating around, right? Before it gets patched, before the vendor's patch. And that 0 day was interesting because it's also bouncing its C2 and exfil off of Soho devices, like QNAP storage devices, right? Or other kind of things like MikroTik routers maybe, or other kind of, I don't know about who the vendors are, but other Soho devices, right? And now you have a device that you don't have visibility into the operating system, you can't have an agent on, running C2 through a Soho device that is from a residential address where you can't blacklist that either. And it's only doing it once via fast flux, so you're not going to blacklist it anyway because the IOC is stale before you even operationalize it. So, and not only that, now you have an architecture where the NSA has no purview. Yeah, they can't look at that, right? So these bad guys are getting smart enough to hit these devices all the way across the board to just hide in plain sight.
And vulnerabilities can hide in these platforms so well. We were just covering the. It'll be released this week with the Exim vulnerability. And when I read the report from the researchers at Qualys, one of the things that stood out to me was when something gets labeled as a bug and it gets repackaged in something else, if it's not labeled a security bug, oftentimes it won't be integrated unless there's extraneous circumstances like, oh, this is a bug fix we need. But oftentimes it's up to the original maintainers to flag something as a security bug, and they don't know that. So it goes downstream to everyone who's incorporating this software. As we're talking about, appliances are largely a conglomeration of different types of firmware and software. If it's not flagged as a security bug, it's not getting fixed. It might be a bug that they didn't fix, but lo and behold, it is a security vulnerability. Debian had this problem. A lot of distributions have had this problem, and a lot of folks that put together these custom appliances also suffer from this.
Yeah, and there's the thing that's interesting. If you're an enterprise, like you and I, or the enterprise, we'll never know whether that RCE bug, for any, no vendors mentioned here, right? Because it doesn't matter whether an RCE bug is a bug or a feature.
Right.
We'll, you and I will not know that anytime in this next decade, probably, right? Software bill of materials, FBOM, whatever, like that's not going to change whether or not you and I have that kind of intel. And so the point of saying that is that the enterprise needs to treat it as either or. Like you have to assume that these appliances, if you look at the scoreboard for the last 18 months and you just look at it, you say, I need to register this kind of risk in my enterprise. And so if I have a device here that is likely to have an RCE over the next 12 months, what are the other devices around it? Yeah. Or does it sit between IT and OT? And do I implicitly trust it because it's made by a big OEM who's an American brand name maybe that I trust? So you got to break all of that implicit trust, and you have to move to zero trust and verify, then trust. That's one part of zero trust I'm on board with, is not assuming trust in a device because of its certificate, its provenance, or its brand name.
Yeah. So Scott, do you have new features that you're announcing at Eclipsium for this RSA? Is that stuff public?
Yeah, it's. I don't know if we made the official announcement quite yet. Full blast on the website, etc. But it's a lot of it has to do with what we've been talking about. Go figure. But which is addressing what we call connected devices, right? The ability for a device, let's say with our agent on it, to see all the other devices around it and understand if those might be vulnerable. Because risks flow. If this is the center of my universe, which is a device, let's say with our agent on it, x86 box, let's say, what is the risk this box presents to those devices around it? And inversely, what is the risk that those other devices might present to it based on known vulnerabilities, based on the fact that a lot of your ransomware games have automated all the lateral movement and worming they need to do ever at this point. And you have to understand the risk of devices in the context of other devices. So, new functionality, new features to focus primarily on what you and I just defined as those critical devices: VPNs, routers, firewalls, things like Soho devices or MikroTik, routers that TrickBot group might fall back to as part of their C2. Understanding that these things can be turned in one day as a DDoS agent and another day as a C2 exfil, type of device, and they're inside your network. and you're trusting them, and your compromised devices can bounce off them internally to egress as well, and your firewall rules will allow it because that's a trusted device inside your network. So like understanding this device paradigm, all of us are trying to get our heads around it. There's different ways to do it. You can put a layer 2 bump in the wire and look at protocols and headers and understand a lot of things going on. But there's other ways you need to touch devices too when it comes to verification. So if you're running like a normal vulnerability scan, you say, I've got a really bad vulnerability. A lot of times you need to put a human resource on that to validate that that vulnerability is not a false positive. It is exploitable, actually, that kind of thing. So what we're trying to do is automate some of that, especially for these critical vulnerabilities. It's a very strange and precarious place to be. But it's been asked of us by like our customers, the profile of our customers being in 50% federal, 50% commercial. We're getting it from those very large organizations that really want to be able to, like we said, take back that security control, validate something or verify it before we trust it, and do that continuously over the life cycle of a device rather than just a point of time when you take delivery.
Fantastic. Scott, thank you so much for appearing on Security Weekly.
Paul, thank you for having me. This is great. I'll see you in the Q&A and Discord.
Sounds good. For folks who want to learn more, you can visit securityweekly.com/Eclipsium.